In the summer of 1891, the sheep began vanishing off the ridge above the Little Tennessee. There were no drag marks, no blood trails, only a scrape of wool on a high branch where no carcass should ever hang. The cove farmers blamed panthers, then bears, then the wind, and none of it fit what they actually found. Few ridges over, the Cherokee already had the story, complete with the cliff, the cave, and the being's name. What the settlers spent a season being terrified of, the elders had been carrying for generations, and the place is still there. There's a kind of silence along the Little Tennessee that doesn't belong to this century. Isn't the quiet of an empty road or a slow Sunday. It's older than that, denser, the kind that seems to hold a memory, and anyone who has walked those valleys in the hour before dark knows what it carries. In 1891, that silence was the loudest thing in the mountains. If you enjoy this kind of story and want to keep the channel going, the link to support us is in the description and the pinned comment. It's what keeps these valleys speaking out loud. Back then, the Great Smoky Mountains weren't a park. There were no paved roads cutting through the gaps, no gates, no lines of cars at the overlooks. The blue haze the range is named for hung over the peaks the same way it had for centuries, and the only way through it was a horse, a wagon, or your own 2 feet on a dirt trail that turned to soup in the rain. The people who lived in those coves were an hour's walk from their nearest neighbor on a good day and a half a day on a bad one. There were no telephones. There was only the forest, the river, and the people beside you. And a few ridges over, on the other side of those dark slopes, there was another. People entirely. The eastern band of the Cherokee had held on to that corner of the mountains when most of their nation was driven out west on the removal 50 years before. They lived along the Oconaluftee and the Little Tennessee, in the same coves and on the same rivers the settlers were now farming, and they had been there long enough that the names of the places were still their names. The settlers knew they were there. They traded with them now and then, crossed paths on the river trails, kept a wary distance that both sides had mostly agreed to call politeness. What the settlers didn't know, because they had never thought to ask, was how much those neighbors knew about the ground they were all standing on. The coves along the Little Tennessee in Blount County were sheep and corn country. Families kept flocks on the high ridges through the warm months, let the hogs run loose in the oak flats, grew corn in the bottoms, and dug ginseng out of the dark hollows when the price was right. Losing stock to the woods wasn't a mystery in those years, it was a tax. Bears took a calf, now and then, a panther. If one was still working that stretch of the range, took a foal. The last wolves in those parts were nearly gone. But a man still locked his chickens up at night, because something was always willing to take what wasn't watched. Hosea Vance ran one of those flocks. He was in his 40s, tall enough to be noticed, quiet enough to be forgotten, the kind of man who read the woods the way a clerk reads a ledger. He had a wife and 2 grown sons and a daughter still at home, and the flock on the ridge was the family's margin. Lose the ridge pasture, and they'd lose the farm inside 2 seasons, and he knew it the way. He knew the weight of his own rifle. The first loss came in the last week of June, a ewe gone off the south end of the ridge, where the trees thin out above the river. Hosea rode the line at dawn, expecting the usual, a drag trail, blood in the ferns, a carcass picked down to the ribs by morning. He found none of it. What he found was a tuft of wool caught on a branch about 8 feet off the ground, in a tulip poplar that shouldn't have had anything in it but bark. Below it the dirt was clean, with no prints, no blood, no dragged furrow, just a sheep that had stopped existing between one night and the next, and a piece of itself left behind in a place no walking animal could have reached. He stood under that branch a long time. A panther kills on the ground and drags. A bear kills on the ground and stays. Whatever had taken that ewe had lifted it, whole, off the ridge and into the air. And that wasn't a thing his life had a name for yet. By the second week of July, it was 3 ewes and a young ram, all gone the same way, all off the high end of the ridge, where it looks down toward the river. The scenes were never quite the same, but they rhymed. A little wool high in a tree, a scrape of horn on a branch that no ground animal could have reached. One time a hoof print pressed straight down into the seep spring at the head of the hollow deep, as if the animal had been dropped rather than walked, and beside it nothing. Hosea stopped sleeping through the night. He'd go up the ridge at 2 in the morning with a lantern and sit against the big chestnut at the edge of the pasture, rifle across his knees, and watch the flock breathe in the dark. He heard nothing, he saw nothing. The flock would be tight and quiet when he came up, and tight and quiet when he left, and one of them would be missing by morning anyway. His neighbor Tom Sutter rode over on a Saturday and found him on the ridge at noon, still in the same clothes from the night before. Tom was a big man with a loud opinion about most things, and he tried out a few of them on the way back down. A panther, he said. Maybe a big owl, the kind the old-timers called a hoot owl on account of the sound it made, gone to monstrous size for lack of anything better to do. Hosea listened and said nothing, because the things he'd found didn't fit any of it, and saying so out loud would have made it more real. The next evening, Tom's boy Lon came up to help. Lon was 17, all arms and legs, and the kind of courage that hasn't been tested yet. And he swore he'd seen something the night before. A shadow, he said, passing over the south face of the ridge, big enough to darken the whole clearing for the length of one breath. He'd been coming up the trail with the dogs, and the light went out of the air for a second, and then came back, and the dogs had gone to ground and wouldn't move for 10 minutes after. Hosea walked the ridge with him the next morning to see the spot where the dogs had frozen. The brush was pressed flat in a wide circle at the head of the hollow, the way brush gets pressed when something heavy has landed and taken off again, and the smell was still there, faint, old, and high, like a hawk pen, but wrong, the kind of smell that sits in the back of the throat and doesn't leave. A hawk pen is a small, sharp, dry smell. This was bigger and wetter and older than anything alive should be carrying, and the dogs wouldn't go near the circle even with Hosea pulling them. Hosea didn't believe him. He wanted to, which was worse. A man can fight a thing he's seen. A man can argue with a panther. But a shadow that puts out the light over a whole clearing is a different kind of problem, and Hosea had no rifle for that. He went home that night and sat at the kitchen table without eating, and his wife asked him what was wrong, and he said it was the sheep. It wasn't the sheep. The sheep were the price of the farm, and the farm was the price of the family, and he could feel the weight of both of them on the ridge above him in the dark, and something up there was taking them off the earth, one by one, all, into a place he couldn't follow. It was the calf that broke the cove's peace. Tom Sutter had a milk cow and a heifer coming on, and the heifer dropped a calf in the lower pasture. The 3rd week of July, a little red thing, still wet and unsteady on its legs. Lon was on the ridge trail that evening, coming back from checking the fences, and he saw it happen. He told the cove later, in a voice that didn't sound like his own. The thing came down out of the gap above the pasture, he said. It didn't swoop the way a hawk swoops circling in. It dropped, heavy, the way a stone drops, and it hit the calf in the lower field, and the calf left the ground in its grip. He said the head turned once toward him, and the head was bigger than a man's chest, and the eyes were set forward the way a hawk's are. And then it was over the trees and gone, and the calf was gone with it, and the heifer was still standing where she'd been, bawling at nothing. Lon ran. He didn't stop running until he hit Hosea's porch, and when he got there, he couldn't speak for a full minute. And when he could, the words came out in the wrong order. The cove heard it by the next morning. By the afternoon, they'd stopped calling him. A boy with a story, a thing like that rearranges a community's sense of what is real. The men who'd joked about a giant owl stopped joking. The women who'd told Lon to quit filling the children's heads with nonsense stopped saying it. People began locking their stock in the barns at night and lighting lanterns along the fence lines and sleeping lighter than they had in years. The ridge above the Little Tennessee went from being pasture to being a place you didn't go after the sun dropped behind the peaks. Someone, Hosea never knew who, brought up a story from out west. A newspaper story from a place called Tombstone in Arizona, printed the year before, about 2 ranchers who'd found a flying monster out on the desert and chased it down with Winchesters and shot it and measured it out at some impossible length. The Cove passed the story around, and most of them shrugged it off as the kind of thing frontier papers printed to sell copies, a tall tale dressed up in measurements. But it lodged. A thing printed in a paper is a thing someone else believed first, and once a man has heard that someone else believed it, his own disbelief gets a crack in it. Lon had been within 30 feet of the thing when it took the calf. He'd been close enough to be taken himself, and he wasn't, and the Cove understood that the way they understood a near miss in a thunderstorm. The boy had walked back from the edge of something, and the edge of something was now on the ridge above their houses, and the rifles on their walls hadn't been built for it. The Cove tried the rifle anyway, because a rifle was the only answer they had. 4 men sat up on the ridge past dark one night with lanterns and shotguns, spread out along the fence line where the pasture met the trees. Around midnight they heard something pass over them that pushed the lantern flames sideways and put the dogs to ground for the second time in a week, and none of them saw it well enough to shoot. In the morning 2 more ewes were gone off the far end of the ridge, taken in the dark while the men with the guns were watching the wrong end. The rifle hadn't been built for a thing that came out of the air and left through it, and the Cove began to understand that the rifle wasn't going to save them. Step back from the Cove for a moment, because the honest part of this story is that the 1,890 seconds were full of giant bird stories in print, and most of them weren't true. In April of 1890, the Tombstone Epitaph, over in Arizona, ran a piece headlined about a strange winged monster discovered and killed on the Huachuca Desert. 2 ranchers, the paper said, found a huge flying thing resting on the desert between the Huachuca and the Whetstone Mountains, chased it for miles on horseback as it lurched into the air in short exhausted flights, and finally shot it down with their Winchesters. They measured it out at 92 feet long, the paper said, with a wingspan of 160 feet and a head 8 feet long, and eyes the size of a dinner plate. Then they announced they were going to skin it and send the body east for the scientists. There was never a follow-up article. No body ever arrived. No scientist ever examined anything. The San Francisco Examiner reprinted the story with an illustration that treated the whole thing as entertainment, which is what it was. Frontier newspapers in those years printed tall tales the way a stove burns wood. Gullible editors, bored writers, papers hungry for sales. The math was simple. A fantastic story sold copies, and the risk of being wrong was 0, because nobody came back to check. The Tombstone monster fits that mold down to the ground. 2 unnamed ranchers. An impossible wingspan, no body, no follow-up, and the comfortable fact that a 160-foot flying reptile has never existed anywhere outside a medieval bestiary. Years later, in 1963, a men's magazine would run a piece claiming that back in 1886, 2 prospectors had nailed a dead thunderbird to the wall of the Tombstone Epitaph building and photographed it. A creature with a 36-foot wingspan, 6 men standing under it with their arms touching. The photo was never found. The paper never printed photographs in 1886. The story is almost certainly a legend built on a legend, and the people who tell it have been looking for a picture that was never taken for 60 years now. So, the skeptical read of the Smoky's losses is the one a reasonable person should reach for first. Maybe it's a panther working that stretch of ridge, silent and strong enough to carry a small sheep a short distance into a tree, or a bear on a bad night taking a calf, or a weather-stressed eagle, an old one gone bold from hunger, the kind of thing that happens once in a long while and gets talked about for a generation. Or maybe it's simply a season of fear in an isolated cove, where one strange loss becomes 2 in the telling, and 2 become a pattern, and a pattern becomes a shadow that darkens a clearing, because that's what fear does to a community that has no telephone and no sheriff close enough to call. Those are the explanations that should hold, and yet the drag marks that should be there are missing. The wool is caught 8 feet up in a tree. No ground animal can reach. A hoof print is pressed straight down into a seep spring, as if the animal was dropped, and a boy walked back from the edge of something with a description he couldn't have invented. The honest part is that the comfortable explanation covers most of it, and then there's a piece left over that the comfortable explanation doesn't cover, and that piece is the whole story. Late summer in the Smokies is a slow brown time. The heat sits in the coves and doesn't move. The mist comes up off the river at dusk and hangs in the trees till mid-morning, and the light goes out of the day, early behind the ridges. It was in that light, the third week of August, that Lon Sutter took the flock up the ridge for the evening and didn't come down. His father waited supper for him, then waited breakfast, then saddled the mare, rode up the trail at first light with two of the cove men behind him. They found his crook snapped in two on a high rock at the edge of the pasture, the kind of break that comes from a hard sideways pull, not a fall. They found a boot scrape on a branch in the tulip poplars above the ridge path, 12 feet up. The wool scrape pattern again, but in a place no sheep had ever been. Below it, the dirt was clean, with no body, no drag, no blood, and Lon Sutter. 17 years old, and all arms and legs, and the kind of courage that finally got tested, had left the earth the same way the sheep had left it, between one breath and the next, into the air. The cove broke. A posse rode the ridges for 3 days, and found nothing the forest didn't already own. A boot, a torn piece of shirt, nothing that told them where to look or what to point a rifle at. Tom Sutter stopped speaking. He sat on his porch for a week with his hat in his hands and his wife bringing him food he didn't touch, and the men who came to sit with him didn't know what to say because there was nothing to say, and the silence in that kitchen was the same silence that lived on the ridge. Hosea watched it happen. He'd watched the losses climb from a ewe to a ram, to a calf, to a boy he'd known since the boy was born, and the rifle on his wall and the posse on the ridge had done nothing to stop the climb. And the thing on the ridge wasn't an animal, and the rifle wasn't built for what it was. He sat with Tom one night, and neither of them spoke, and in the morning Hosea saddled his horse and rode east, toward the Qualla boundary, toward the people his people had spent his whole life keeping at a distance. He was crossing a line he'd been raised on a white farmer in the 1892. Smokies didn't ride to the Cherokee for help. He went to the sheriff or the preacher or his neighbors, or he handled it himself. But the sheriff was a day's ride and a joke. The preacher had no answer for a thing with talons. The neighbors were sitting on their porches, afraid of the dark, and handling it himself had already cost a boy his life. So Hosea rode east, toward the Okanalufti, toward the people who had been in those mountains longer than his people had been on the continent, to ask them what was on the ridge, because he had run out of his own answers, and he suspected, in the part of himself he didn't like to look at, that they had never lost theirs. He expected suspicion at the settlement, and he got something worse. He expected to be turned away at the edge of the boundary by a man who didn't want a white farmer's trouble on Cherokee ground. Instead, they let him in, sat him down, and asked him one question. Where, they said? Where on the river? He told them. The ridge above the Little Tennessee, below the mouth of Citico Creek, and the room changed. There were 2 elders in that room who carried the old stories, and they're real people, not invented for this telling. Swimmer, whose Cherokee name was Ah-Yun-een, was in his early 60s then, a medicine man and a storyteller, a man who'd served in the war and come home and spent his life keeping the knowledge of his people in his head. Ayasta, whose English name was Sally Terrapin, was in her 50s, a basket maker and a traditionalist, the widow of one medicine man and the mother of another, the only woman allowed to speak in council among the Eastern Cherokee. Between them, they held more of the old stories than anyone writing in English would ever get down on paper, and a few years later, a quiet man from the Bureau of American Ethnology named James Mooney would come and write a great deal of it down. But in 1891, it was still mostly in their mouths and still mostly only for their people. They told Hosea the story, and the story had a name, Tlanua, the great mythic hawk. A pair of them, they said, immense raptors, bigger than anything alive now, that had nested in a cave high in the cliff above the river at a place called Tlanuwa'i, the Tlanua place, just below where Citico Creek runs into the Little Tennessee on the north bank. The cliff is still there, they told him, halfway up a cave with 2 openings, the rock jutting out so you can't see the mouth from above, white streaks running down the rock to the water, the droppings of the old birds still on the stone. In the old story, the pair flew up and down the river hunting, and when they began carrying off the people's children, the village turned to a medicine man, and the medicine man arranged an ambush from a canoe. Beneath the cliff, warriors floated past with a large basket shield, and when one of the birds dove, they shot it through the body with arrows and knocked it into the river. The other Tlanua circled higher and higher until it vanished into the sky, and that was the one they never saw again. It wasn't a monster story to them. Tlanua, they told him, belongs to the above world. Ukana, the horned serpent that lives in the deep water, belongs to the below world. The two of them fight over the middle world, which is where people live, and the thunderers. The beings who bring the storms keep the serpents down so the people can stay. The cliff at Citico wasn't a lair. It was a place in a sacred geography, a point where the world above came down closest to the world below, and the people who lived near it had always known what that meant, and lived as though it mattered. Then Ayasta said, the hard thing, quietly, the way she said most things. The settlers, she said, had been grazing their flocks on the ridge above Tlanuwa'i. The Cherokee hadn't grazed there in generations, not without ceremony, not without respect. For what the place was, the boundary had been there before. Any fence, it got crossed. And the thing about a boundary like that, in a place like that, is that the people who crossed it never knew there was anything to cross, and the people who kept it never forgot. Hosea sat with that for a long time. He had ridden east for an answer, and he had gotten one, and the answer was older than his country, and it came with a cost attached, and the cost was that the terror on the ridge hadn't come out of nowhere. It had been invited, slowly, over years, by people who hadn't listened, and now a boy was dead, and the answer had been sitting the next hollow over the whole time. He rode back to the cove with the story and a plan. The cove didn't want to believe, and could no longer refuse. The losses hadn't stopped with Lon. Another ewe went off the ridge the night Hosea was gone, and the cove understood in the way a community understands, a thing it has been refusing to understand, that the season wasn't going to end on its own. A small party was gathered. Hosea, because the flock was his and the ridge was his to answer for. Tom Sutter, because Lon was his son, and he was going whether anyone wanted him to or not, and there was no arguing with the look on his face. And a young Cherokee man, sent by the elders, who came down the river trail on a Monday morning, with a calm that made the cove men uncomfortable, because it was the calm of someone who had been raised inside this story and wasn't meeting it for the first time. His name was Sihi, and he didn't say much, and what he said was final. They took a canoe down the Little Tennessee in the late afternoon, 4 men and a wide shield of woven white oak slats and 3 rifles, and they came around the bend below Citico Creek, and the cliff was there, exactly as the elders had said it would be. It rose out of the river, on the north bank, high and gray, the rocks streaked white from a cave about halfway up, down to the waterline, and the cave had 2 openings, and the rock jutted out over them, so the mouth couldn't be seen from above. The cove men went quiet when they saw the streaks. They were too wide to be a hawk's, too high to be a ground animal's, and they had been there a long time. Sihi said the place's name, Tlanua. He said it the way a man says a word he has been careful with his whole life, and the cove men didn't repeat it. The plan was, the elders' plan, translated to the settlers' tools. A canoe beneath the cliff, at dusk, the wide shield up, rifles in place of arrows, and the patience to wait for the dive. Tlanua hunted the river corridor at the turn of the light, Sihi told them, the way it always had. And the only way anyone had ever brought one down was from below, with the shield up, when it committed to the dive. He didn't promise it would work with rifles. He said the old way had worked once, and once was all the story had, and they would have to find out for themselves whether once was enough. He told them the rest of it on the river, low-voiced. While the canoe slid down toward the cliff, the Cherokee didn't hunt Tlanua for sport, he said, and they didn't hunt it for revenge. They hunted it only when it crossed into the middle world and took from the people, and even then they did it the way the story told them to, because the story wasn't just a story, it was a set of instructions, and the instructions had kept the people alive on that river for longer than the cove men's families had been on the continent. The shield wasn't a weapon. The shield was the boundary between the world above and the world below, raised back up where it had been let down. He didn't expect the cove men to understand all of it. He expected them to hold the shield up when he said now. They beached the canoe in the shadow of the overhang and waited. The river went flat and still. The light slid down the cliff, and the white streaks caught the last of it, and then lost it, and the forest on both sides of the water went quiet, the way the forest goes quiet when something is moving through it that the rest of the woods would rather not be under. The cove men felt the wrongness of the place in their chests before they saw anything. The heavy, held breath quiet of a bend in the river that the Cherokee had been careful with for longer than the cove men's families had been in the country. Then the wing beats came, and the river went flat under them. They came down the corridor the way the elders said they would, 2 of them, and they were bigger than the cove men had prepared for. The wing beats pushed the water flat ahead of them, and the air in the overhang went cold, and the 2 birds turned the bend above Citico Creek in the last of the light, and the cove men saw the size of them and understood, all at once, why the old story had taken a medicine man and a canoe and a shield and a whole village to finish. "Twi see," he said, now very quietly, and the shield came up. The first bird committed to the dive. It came down out of the gap above the cliff the way Lon had described the calf, heavy, a drop rather than a swoop, and the shield came up, and the rifles cracked, and the first Tlanua took the load through the body and tumbled into the river in a thrash of foam and broken wing that put water over the bow of the canoe. It was the second bird that the cove men hadn't prepared for, because the second bird didn't flee. It dropped on the canoe. Tom Sutter, who had come to kill the thing that took his son, was caught by the shoulder and dragged half out of the canoe and into the water before anyone understood what was happening, and the river was shallow there, but the bird wasn't shallow, and the wings were beating the water into a white wall around them. Tisihi got Tom under the overhang by raw force, a hand in his collar and a knee against the gunwale, and Hosea put a second load into the first bird, where it thrashed in the shallows to keep it down, because a thing that big wounded in the water was as much a problem as a thing that big in the air. The second, Tlanua, pulled up. It circled the cliff once, low close enough that the cove men could see the forward set of its eyes and the size of its head against the rock, and then it went higher and higher, and the wing beats got slower and farther apart, and it rose until it was a point against the coming dark, and then it wasn't a point at all, and the river went still. They brought the dead bird to the bank. It was real, and it was wrong, too large, an old shape the cove men had no word for, the kind of thing that doesn't belong in any season a man is living in. The wings were still half spread in the shallows, and the river moved around them, and the talons were locked open in the mud, and each one was longer than a man's hand, and the feathers, where the blood wasn't, were dark and stiff and old, the way leather is old, not the way a bird's feathers are. Hosea touched one wing and pulled his hand back. It was warm, and it was the wrong kind of warm. The warm of a thing that had been alive a long time and wasn't ready to be done. They didn't mount it on a wall. They didn't photograph it. They didn't skin it to send east for the scientists, which is what the men in the tombstone story had promised to do with their monster, and never did, because there had never been a monster to skin. The cove men did the opposite. They buried it where Tsihi told them to bury it, below the cliff in the bend, and they didn't speak its name. Outside the cove, and the Cherokee man rode back up the river trail in the morning, and the cove didn't see him again. Tom Sutter lived. He carried the marks on his shoulder for the rest of his life, and he didn't go back to the river, and the rifle he'd taken with him that night stayed oiled and loaded above his door for 30 years and was never fired again. The losses stopped. The ridge above Tlanuwa'i wasn't grazed again, not by Hosea, not by his sons, not by anyone in the cove who heard the story and passed it on, and the cove passed it on quietly, the way you pass on, a thing that's partly a warning and partly a shame. Lon Sutter was never found. The forest on that ridge took him the way the forest takes everything it's given, and the Sutter kitchen stayed quiet about him in the way the kitchens do when a boy doesn't come home. A few years later, a quiet man from the Bureau of American Ethnology came through the eastern Cherokee. His name was James Mooney, and he had been studying the Cherokee since 1887 and 1888, and he came back through the 1,890 seconds with a notebook and a patience for sitting and listening, and the shamans and the storytellers let him write down what they carried. Swimmer gave him 3/4 of the myths he recorded, more than anyone else, and Ayasta gave him the version of how the world was made that he trusted most. In 1900, in the 19th Annual Report of the Bureau of American Ethnology, Mooney published The Nest of the Tlanua, with the cliff and the cave and the white streaks at Citico, exactly where Hosea had stood that night, exactly where the elders said it would be. That's the reason the legend survived in print. The settlers' version didn't survive, because the settlers buried it. They buried the bird, they buried the name, they buried the shame of having grazed where they shouldn't have, and they didn't give it to a man with a notebook, and so the only record that came down is the Cherokee one, which is also the older one, which is also the one that was right. Now hold the skeptical thread honestly, because it matters. It could have been a panther, or a bear on a bad night, or a weather-stressed eagle gone bold, or a season of fear in an isolated cove that turned every shadow into a bird, the way fear does when there's no telephone and no sheriff close enough to call. Those explanations cover most of it. And then there's the wool, 8 feet up in a tree. No ground animal can reach, and the hoofprint pressed straight down into a seep spring, as if the animal was dropped, and a boy who walked back from the edge of something and described a head bigger than a man's chest, and a boy who didn't walk back at all. Pick the comfortable explanation. The story still has a piece left over that the comfortable explanation won't cover, and that piece is the whole story. The deeper truth is the one Ayasta gave Hosea in the quiet of that room. The Cherokee didn't need a newspaper to tell them what was on the river. They had the name Tlanua, and the place, Tlanuwa'i, and the method, the canoe, and the shield, and the patience to wait for the dive, and the respect not to graze there in the first place. The settlers spent a season being terrified of something the people next door had been carrying for generations, and the terror was the cost of not listening, and the not listening was the cost of a boundary that the people who crossed it never knew was there. The mountains weren't keeping a secret from anyone. One group was listening, and one group wasn't, and the group that wasn't listening paid for it in sheep and a calf and a boy named Lon, and then they rode east and asked, and the people they asked already had the answer, complete, with the cliff and the cave and the white streaks in the name. The white streaks are still on the cliff at Citico, and the second Tlanua was never seen again, which isn't the same as never being anywhere. A legend that ends with one bird down and one gone up into the sky doesn't end. It just stops being told out loud. If you want the next one, the mountains kept. Subscribe. The Hollow notices who stays.